Thanks very much. And let me just say it's a pleasure to be joining you all today. I'd love to start by commending you for undertaking this effort and this inquiry. This is a massive problem across the OSCE, which covers 57 countries from North America to Central Asia and the Russian Federation. And yet you are one of the few parliaments to be asking these questions. And that should be commended and celebrated. It's a matter of urgent concern that these websites be addressed, and I think as co-chair McGuire discussed, they essentially amount to online brothels, or at least insofar as connecting sex buyers with people who are being prostituted. To provide just a moment of context on my experience and my interest in this matter, as the special representative for the OSCE, I'm tasked with supporting the 57 countries in their work to combat trafficking. And we've been looking closely at this issue of websites and mapping them across the OSCE region and discovered hundreds, if not thousands of them. What we've seen is very, very similar to what co-chair McGuire described in her introduction. Second of all, I have the good fortune to be a prosecutor for a number of years, where my experience was also very similar to what was described in the introduction, namely that virtually 100% of my cases involved these websites near the end of my career. And they vastly exceeded our capacity to respond to. And I think that's maybe the first point that is worth emphasizing here, is that the scale that these websites facilitate in terms of exploitation is tremendous. At its height in the United States, there was some 200,000 ads a day posted in that country. Across the US, which is virtually impossible for law enforcement to meaningfully address. Now, you can argue over what percentage of those involve exploitation or not, but the point is that ferreting out the exploitation is extremely difficult and vastly, as I said, exceeds the capacity of law enforcement to deal with. What we have seen is an exponential growth of these websites over the last few years. And that's a second problem, because there haven't been any initiatives to try to slow that down, with the exception of a few countries, including the United States, which adopted a law to address these websites. Israel has done the same, and a few others sprinkled around. But for the most part, they've gone unaddressed. What I think, in addition to the problem of scalability, the second problem is one that co-chair McGuire also highlighted, which is the complete lack of safeguards. Some of these websites claim that they have monitors, but our experience in the United States with some of the biggest market-leading websites was that the number of monitors and the quality of monitoring was basically worthless. The result being that children and exploited adults trafficked adults were on those sites all the time. And again, law enforcement just couldn't keep up with the volume of the problem. That monitoring function that is claimed by these sites is not a safeguard that has any value at all in preventing the problem. The third issue is that this scale increase is so much larger than the value that this provides to police. And I'm really delighted that co-chair McGuire mentioned this problem, because we hear sometimes from the police that these websites are of value because it tells them where to go and what to look for, and they can get good evidence. All that's true. But the problem is that their ability to respond to this volume is so limited, and the value to traffickers is so much greater, that the problem is worse if you allow the websites than if you don't. We know this because survivors have told us this by outlining how frequently they are sold on these sites compared to how they were sold prior to the internet. We also know it because despite law enforcement presence on these sites, the traffickers still go there. So clearly there's a value to them. And we know this also by listening to the traffickers. Just a few days ago, I was reading a report where a trafficker was talking about these websites being the most useful thing that ever came along for his business, because he can sell more women, more girls, more often than he ever could on the street. And as we just heard from Ms. Andrews, the harm then is amplified in an exponential way, which leads to even more trauma and distress for trafficked individuals. So let me talk about, just briefly to conclude, a couple solutions which are very much in line with the recommendations that were just mentioned a few moments ago. The first is there needs to be a lot more training of law enforcement on how to deal with these websites. Even in countries where they're aware, they're mostly fumbling their work on these websites by trying to negotiate with the websites for evidence, by waiting for phone calls about possible victims. This is not the way to go. They need to be proactive, they need to be mapping the landscape, and they need to be conducting operations regularly if they want to try to get a grip on the problem and provide just a little bit of risk on these websites. The second is much more prevention work related to the websites. And here I hope that Rob will talk a little bit about this when he speaks, but there's a lot of work that can be done with technology to try to disrupt and deter the demand side on these websites, including counter messaging, chatbots, and so forth, which can provide a lot of amplification of the law enforcement effort. But third, and ultimately, it's going to come down to a need for policy solutions. And the policy solutions could go two directions. One is that somebody develops an age and consent verification mechanism. The current model right now is that you can allow any material on there until somebody decides or discovers that it's illegal and harmful, and then the goal is to take it off. That is not the way to go in an industry that is just rife with risk. The way that you have to approach these websites is to not allow the content unless it can be confirmed that it is not exploitation. That is a much more safe way for survivors and for trafficking victims than to just simply default to allowing everything until somebody complains, which is the current model. Now, interestingly enough, this winter in the United States, one such age and consent verification bill was introduced. It's still being considered, but it could be a possible model for consideration in the future. The second, much more likely option for policy action is to prohibit third-party advertising online of prostitution. This is the approach that was taken by a different law in the United States, and within days, decimated the online market. It fractured it, websites closed down immediately. This is the way to disrupt that market in a significant way. However, if such a policy is considered, I would also follow very closely with the recommendations from Co-Chair McGuire for robust services for those exiting prostitution to ensure that they have the support and access to assistance that they need. Finally, I think the last suggestion that I have is the one that was mentioned, which is to robustly and intentionally develop a strategy to combat demand. This is not happening in most countries, even though under the Palermo Protocol, to which there are 178 signatories, all countries that signed are required to address demand. So I think that this is maybe the longer term strategy for countries as they try to deal with this problem. I'll stop there. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak, and thank you again for your work on this important issue.